Welcome to this week's episode of the Liberty Unveiled podcast, formerly the Tishua Unveiled podcast. I am your host, Brad Hopp, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Pastor Sam Jones. Together, we are unveiling liberty one episode at a time. We'll be discussing the latest in trafficking news, insider stories from those being delivered, and studying the Founders Bible to learn how to return America to sanity and true freedom. Our sponsor for today's show is Tishua Tea Company. Visit tishuatea.com or deliverancet.com. Hi, and welcome to the Liberty Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Brad Hopp, and as you can tell, my friend and co-host, Pastor Sam Jones, wasn't able to be here this week. He and Miss Sarah, his wife, they're foster parents, as a lot of you know, or our regular listeners know, but they recently took in a newborn who his mom was a meth head, and so the baby has been going through some withdrawals and stuff. So you can keep them in prayer, and especially keep the new baby in prayer that it would recover from and be healed of the effects of the meth and stuff. So I'm going to kind of dive into what is Liberty Unveiled, what is the Tishua Tea Company, and for those of you that don't know, or those of our first-time listeners, Tishua Tea Company is a partnership between myself and a missionary to communist Asia, and he and the team rescue underage girls from sex trafficking. They get the girls into our rescue and rehab facility where we give them medical care, all new clothing, all new toiletries. We meet all of their physical needs. We give them an education. We teach them to read and write and do their math, and we catch them up to speed there. But then we take it a step further and we teach them how to harvest and process tea and coffee, how to make bracelets, how to make coasters, how to run a tea shop, how to run a CNC machine. But then what we do is we buy all these products from the girls, giving them economic empowerment while they're still under our care, so that then when they leave our rescue facility, they have the ability to stand on their own. They have economic empowerment, and they're able to provide for themselves. And so that is Tishua Tea Company in a nutshell. When people purchase some of the products, half the profits and 100% of the donations go back to the rescue facility. So what does that mean? Okay, so first off, we bought the products from the girls up front, so they've already been paid for everything that we're selling. They've already been paid for. But then when we sell products, then half our profits go back to the rescue facility to care for the house and to make sure that the staff is paid and all this stuff. Going along that lines, we have some really exciting news that I want to share, and I don't believe I shared it in the last episode. And by the way, to our regular listeners, I apologize that I missed last week's episode getting it out. I got an emergency phone call on Monday asking if I could fly up to Montreal, Canada, and bring a fire truck back. For those of you that are regular listeners, you know that I've gone back to delivering fire trucks and part-time just to kind of help keep things going and stuff. But so I had to fly up there and bring a truck back out of Canada down to Rhode Island, and then fly over to Michigan and bring one back from there and bring it home here. So anyway, last week was just a crazy week, and so I apologize that we didn't get an episode out like we should have. But anyway, so as I said, we have some really exciting news. So two of the girls, let me back up. So at the first part of October, we secured a second rescue facility, because those of you that are regular listeners know that we've had 41 girls and 2 female staff living in a 2,300 square foot rescue facility. Obviously, we really needed more space. So around October 1st, we were able to secure that new rescue facility. So now we have 2 homes for the girls. But that means we need more staff. So what we ended up doing is the 2 girls, or the 2 young ladies that were our house moms overseeing the rescue facility, have split up their team. And so now they are each overseeing a rescue facility. But the really exciting part is some of the girls that we earlier on rescued are now assistant house moms. So we have 2 young ladies that have recovered to the point that they're now assistant house moms, and they're actually paying back and able to sew into the new girls that are just coming in and that have been just rescued over the course of the last 10 months. And so they're able to pour into those young ladies, and they're able to help them recover and help them be restored and healed and delivered. So on another note, on a more personal note, especially for Andrew, I would ask that you guys keep him and his family in prayer. They, I think it was just yesterday that his mom went home to be with Jesus. So they're going through the loss of his mom. She was, no thanks to coronavirus, she was healthy as healthy as could be, living in a nursing home and stuff. But because of the isolation and the forced lockdowns of the nursing home and everything, the last time they were able to see her, they had to stand 18 feet away from her, and so because of that, she had lost her appetite and was really just isolated and stuff. And they had actually put her on hospice to be able to try to get the hospice doctors and nurses and stuff in there to see her, and the nursing home wouldn't even let them in there. And so she pretty much deteriorated from there, and so she did go home to be with Jesus. And so Andrew and his family are obviously suffering the loss of her, so please keep them in prayer. But we don't really want to dive into where we were. As you know, for those of our regular listeners, we go through the Founder's Bible, and we're going through the commentaries written by David Barton and several other historians. And we're going through and we're examining, what did our founding fathers, when America was founding, what did they believe about the foundation of America? What did they believe about the Bible? What did they believe about its influence on American culture? And how is the source of the freedom that the girls are experiencing, how does that correlate to the same, or being the same source of freedom that America has experienced for its over 200 years of existence? And how is that source of freedom that the girls are experiencing, how does that tie into, and does it have anything to do with our either freedom or bondage to what's coming down the pipe? And so we've been examining this. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the founding of America as far as remembering our national birthday. What were the effects, or what were the parallels between the children of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt and America's foundation, and it's coming out from under, or are coming out from under, King George III? What were the parallels? What were the similarities? And then we'll also go into, a little bit later, we're going to talk about, did America suffer punishment because of our slavery? And we'll get into that a little bit more, and we'll talk about some of this. So it's there's some really good content here today, so I hope you stick with us and enjoy the show here. So or enjoy the podcast, I should say. So we've been going through, we're into Exodus 13 now, and this commentary is titled Remembering Our National Birthday, Exodus 13. In Genesis 12, God promised Abraham that he would make a nation from Abraham's descendants. It took hundreds of years, but that promise finally came to pass when God raised up Moses to bring them out of bondage in Egypt. It required 10 plagues before an oppressive Pharaoh let the people go. And even after that, they wandered in the wilderness for another 40 years before finally entering the land, where they actually became established as an independent nation. But the turning point for the independence of the Jews, the decisive moment in their establishment as a nation, was the Passover, when God, in a miraculous demonstration of power, struck down the firstborn of the Egyptians. Out of all the amazing things along Israel's lengthy road to becoming an independent nation and people, God commanded them to remember that one particular event and to celebrate the anniversary of that one particular day every year thereafter. Exodus 13:10. And not only were they to honor that day, but they were also to use it to teach a rising generation about what God had done in birthing their nation. Founding Father Elias Boudinot saw a correlation between the account in Exodus 13 and the American experience. As with Israel, much occurred in the many years leading up to and following American independence. But our turning point was one specific event: the approval of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th in a famous speech. In a famous speech in 1798, Buddha expounded on the significant parallels between Israel and what happened with America 4,000 years later. The deliverance of the children of Israel from a state of bondage to an unreasonable tyrant was perpetuated by the Paschal Passover lamb, and enjoining it to their posterity as an annual festival forever, with a remember this day in which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Exodus 13:3. Let us then, my friends and fellow citizens, unite all our endeavors this day to remember with reverential gratitude to our supreme benefactor all the wonderful things he has done for us in our miraculous deliverance from a second Egypt, another house of bondage. And thou shalt show thy son on this day, saying, this day is kept as a day of This day is kept as a day of joy and gladness because of all the great things the Lord has done for us. When we were delivered from the threatening power of an invading foe, and it shall be a sign unto thee upon thy hand, and for a memorial between thine eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in thy mouth. For with a strong hand hast thou been delivered from thine enemies. Thou shalt therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year forever. Exodus 13:8-10. The 4th of July is an annual day of celebration and remembrance, like that in Exodus 13, one of many American practices with biblical precedents. The next commentary comes to us from Exodus 1-14, God's deliverance, the birth of a nation. Exodus 1-14 records the liberation of God's chosen people, the Israelites, from the oppression of the Egyptians, with God leading them out of subjugation and into freedom. It is the record of one miracle after another, a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, to guide and protect them. The miraculous opening of the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. The supernatural return of the sea to its original state, completely destroying the Egyptians and permanently securing the Israelites as an independent nation. Divine protection and sustenance, such as manna from heaven and water from a rock, while crossing the wilderness and before entering the promised land, etc. This entire biblical narrative was a source of inspiration for the founding fathers, who saw themselves in similar circumstances of oppression and tyranny, from which they pleaded for divine intervention and deliverance. Not surprisingly, they regularly invoked this story throughout their own struggle. For example, following Patrick Henry's famous "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech in Virginia, British troops began seizing public supplies and the colonists' gunpowder stored in Williamsburg. Henry, unwilling to allow this British action to go unchecked, gathered the local militia and addressed them in an impassioned speech which reminded them of the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire which guided the children of Israel. Exodus 13:21-22. Of the water gushing from the rock at Horeb. Exodus 17:6. Of the miraculous passage of the Red Sea. Exodus 14. And then, with his eye uplifted, his arms aloft, and his whole soul burning with inspiration, declared that the same God still ruled in the heavens, that he was watching from his throne the oppressions of his people in America, and that he was still strong to deliver and mighty to save. Psalm 24, verse 8, and Zephaniah 3:17. And I want to stop and I want to interject something here. The scripture says, if we who are called by his name, in other words, those who are true Christians, if we will humble ourselves and pray, then he will hear from heaven and he will heal our land, and he will forgive us of our sins. And so we as Christians in America need to be interceding for our nation. We need to be praying for our nation. But more importantly, we need to be looking at our own hearts and making sure that we're not calling evil good and good evil. There are so many Christian denominations today that are preaching absolute blasphemy and heresy and total and complete, just abject calling evil good and good evil. So please, don't find yourself in that camp. Make sure that you're calling good good and evil evil, and that you're not perverting it. Because if you are calling evil good and good evil, God will not hear your prayers, and he will not turn his hand back from you. So it's important for us as Christians to call righteous righteous and evil evil. Because if we do, and we'll stand on that truth of God's word, then he will protect us and he will heal our land. Because we are coming into a day of judgment. We're actually already in the day of judgment. We've been under judgment, and what's going to continue to worsen is what I'm really saying. Is it's not that we're coming into a day of judgment, but we're coming into a day of worsening judgment. A day where if America survives, it'll only be by the skin of her teeth. And it'll only because the righteous sought God and hungered and thirsted for him and sought to seek his face. It is imperative that we as Americans, that we as Christians in America rather, that we apply our allegiance to him first and then to America, and we obey what he says in the voting booth. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So this was Patrick. We were just reading Patrick Henry's words. The following year in Massachusetts, Sam Adams drew similar parallels between King George III's tyrannical behavior and that of the Egyptian pharaoh, observing, I scruple not to affirm it as my opinion that his, King George III's, heart is more obdurate, stubborn, and his disposition towards the American people is more unrelenting and malignant than was that of Pharaoh towards the Israelites in Egypt. But let us not be impatient. It requires time to convince the doubting and inspire the timid. The very day that Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, it also appointed John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin to draft a seal to characterize the spirit of this new nation. Franklin's proposal was directly from the Exodus story. Moses lifting up his wand and dividing the Red Sea, and Pharaoh in his chariot, overwhelmed with the waters. This motto, rebellion to tyrants, is obedience to God. Jefferson likewise proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The seal was finally approved, or the seal as finally approved by the committee was Pharaoh sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand, passing through the divided waters of the Red Sea in pursuit of the Israelites, raised from a pillar of fire in the cloud, expressive of the divine presence and command, beaming on Moses, who stands on the shore and extending his hand over the sea, causes it to overwhelm Pharaoh. Signer of the Declaration, Caesar Rodney of Delaware, also invoked the Exodus imagery, telling his brother, the Israelites, the chosen people of God, met with crosses and disappointments in their journey from the land of bondage to that of liberty, but by a steady perseverance and divine assistance, they at length possessed the promised land. Joshua 15-24. And though he permitteth temporary obstructions, 2 Corinthians 4:17 and 1 Peter 4:12, will one day, with a firm reliance on him, crown his virtuous endeavors with success, 2 Timothy 4:8, and cause the modern pharaohs with their hosts to be buried in the sea of their Toryism, as he did the ancient Pharaoh in the Red Sea, Exodus 14. By 1778, the Americans had suffered many military defeats. While they had won a major battle, or a major victory in the Battle of Saratoga in September 1777, the overall trend had not been good. Yet, Declaration signers such as Benjamin Rush of Pennsylvania were not discouraged. Knowing that the war was far from over, Rush wrote Patrick Henry, and likening America's struggle to that of the Jews against the Egyptians, noted that we were still early in the story. That even though we had taken the first step, there were still many obstacles in the wilderness that would require God's intervention if we were to ever reach the promised land. Sir, we have only passed the Red Sea. A dreary wilderness is still before us, and unless a Moses or a Joshua are raised up on our behalf, we must perish before we reach the promised land. But just as God raised up Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb in Israel, so too in America he raised up leaders such as Generals George Washington, Henry Knox, Benjamin Lincoln, and many others whom he used to secure victory. In 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, British troops surrendered to the Americans, thus ending the military conflict. But King George III was still unwilling to withdraw his troops from America, or even to sign a peace treaty with the Americans, whose diplomats were negotiating with British representatives in Paris. Witnessing the king's reticence to admit that he had been defeated, Founding Father James Duane recognized another parallel to Pharaoh in Exodus, explaining, "Whatever may be the appearance from the passivity of the British and the despair of the Tories, British supporters in America, I do not think peace so near as is generally apprehended. The naval success of the enemy have hardened the heart of the British Pharaoh and rekindled his expiring wishes for our subjugation. The treaty at Paris goes on feebly." Finally, 2 years after the Battle of Yorktown, the king acceded, admitted a defeat, and approved peace with the Americans, finally recognizing our independence. But even after victory was won and the U.S. Constitution written and ratified, the same biblical account continued to be invoked whenever there were discussions about oppressions. For example, in 1791, Founding Father Elias Boudinot of New Jersey, who was strongly anti-slavery, warned those in Congress who wished to preserve slavery that it is true that the Egyptians held the Israelites in bondage for 400 years. But gentlemen cannot forget the consequences that followed. They were delivered by a strong hand and a stretched out arm. And it ought to be remembered that the almighty power that accomplished their deliverance is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13:8. You know, that just hit me. I read this earlier, and we think of American slavery, and as wicked as that was, slavery is still going on today. And the girls that we're dealing with and trying to rescue, those that would hold them in bondage, need to remember that an almighty power, an almighty God that accomplished the Israelites' deliverance is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so no matter how hard it gets, no matter how dangerous it gets, those of us that are fighting for the deliverance and the freedom of those trapped in sexual slavery, in sex trafficking, we have an almighty God on our side. The biblical account of God miraculously delivering his people and supernaturally guiding them to a place of liberty and plenty was a frequently invoked source of inspiration in early America. Today, that passage continues as a lighthouse of hope for those facing difficulties of any type. For its message is unchanged. God can still deliver his children and convey them to their own place of freedom, safety, and abundance, regardless of the circumstances in which they find themselves. We will, with the help of God, deliver these young ladies and convey them to their own place of freedom, safety, and abundance. That is the mission of Tishua Tea Company. That is the mission of Tishua House. That is the mission of Liberty Unveiled, is to do everything in our power to bring abundance, freedom, safety, restoration, healing, and the gospel to these young ladies, and to give them an opportunity to truly live life in freedom. Across the centuries, there have been many different forms of government that have produced widely varying results, some good and some bad. So where does America fit within the various forms? Is it true that we are a democracy, as so many people say? No. What makes our government unique among the nations? And how is it possible that our form of government has not changed in over 2 centuries while operating under the same governing documents? And would the founders affirm that the Bible was instrumental in producing our constitutional republic? And we will get to these questions later on as we move through this. Did you know that it is indisputable that the Ten Commandments, the quintessential representation of the moral law as given in Exodus 20 and repeated in Deuteronomy 5, formed the basis of American law and society? Are you aware of the fact that the Ten Commandments have always been inseparable from the American legal culture? And has anyone told you that there are 4 types of laws in the Bible? Ceremonial, moral, judicial, and social compact laws. And that it's vital to know which commands apply to all areas and which apply to specific ones. And again, we'll get to those questions later on. That's a little teaser for the foretaste coming up. Okay, so we have moved into Exodus 21, verse 16. A just judgment for slavery is the title of this commentary. When the Civil War was winding down in early 1865, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, thus finally eradicating an evil that had gained a foothold in America 2 centuries earlier. But slavery had not survived for those 2 centuries because the majority of Americans supported it, for they did not. I want to read that sentence again. But slavery had not survived for those 2 centuries because the majority of Americans supported it, for they did not. The vast majority opposed slavery, but they lived in the North, which had few slaves. The South had the smallest population of people, but it overwhelmingly had the greatest number of slaves. So for those of you that are following along in your Founders Bible, to see more about how the 3 regions of early America dealt differently with slavery, see the commentary accompanying Exodus 3. So we read that already in an earlier episode. When Congress finally ended slavery nationally, it invited Reverend Henry Highland Garnet to preach a sermon commemorating that momentous event. Much could be said of that address. But of particular note is something Garnet saw in the scriptures. Moses, the greatest of all lawgivers and legislators, said, while his face was yet radiant with the light of Sinai, "Whoso stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, shall surely be put to death." Exodus 21:16. The destroying angel has gone forth through this land to execute the fearful penalties of God's broken law. And I want to repeat this for those of you, or for those of you that may have friends and family that think that reparations are appropriate. God brings judgment upon the lawbreakers. He does not do it 150, 200 years later. He brings it upon them and upon their children. Not 150, 200 years later. So I want to read this again. This is the words of Reverend Henry Highland Garnet. Moses, the greatest of all lawgivers and legislators, said while his face was yet radiant with the light of Sinai, "Whoso stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. The destroying angel has gone forth through this land to execute the fearful penalties of God's broken law." He understood that America lost hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of men and boys fighting the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands. God's just punishment had been brought upon America through the Civil War. God's just judgment had been exacted upon America for its evil of having and allowing slavery. Garnet viewed the Civil War as God's judgment on the nation for having protected the abomination described in Exodus 21:16. From America's earliest years, many others also recognized the consequences that might result from the violation of such scriptural precepts, and therefore worked hard to not just abolish, but also to prevent slavery. Originally introduced into America in the early 1600s in Virginia, its subsequent entry into other parts of the country met with strong opposition. For example, Massachusetts passed the country's earliest anti-slavery law, and the famous black leader W.E.B. Du Bois explained the first use of that law. When a certain Captain Smith, about 1640, attacked an African village and brought some of the unoffending natives home, he was promptly arrested. Eventually, the General Court ordered the Negroes sent home at the colony's expense, conceiving themselves bound by the first opportunity to bear witness against the heinous and crying sin of man-stealing, as also to prescribe such timely redress for what is past and such a law for the future as may sufficiently deter all others belonging to us to have to do in such vile and most odious courses, justly abhorred by all good and just men. While the northern colonies opposed slavery, a century later, they found themselves facing a surprising source of opposition to their efforts. In the early 1770s, colonies such as Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and others had passed anti-slavery laws. But King George III and his British governors in America vetoed those laws. There were people passing laws banning slavery already in the 1770s. But it was King George, the British Crown, that vetoed the laws. The king was pro-slavery. The British Empire practiced slavery, and as long as America remained part of the British Empire, it too would practice slavery. This British-imposed pro-slavery policy was a source of great discontent for many founders, including Henry Laurens, a president of Congress during the American Revolution, who lamented, "I abhor slavery, but I was born in a country where slavery had been established by British kings and parliaments ages before my existence." Since the only way for any of the states to enforce measures against slavery was to separate from Great Britain. You want to know why the American Revolution was fought? This is one of the reasons right here. Since the only way for any of the states to enforce measures against slavery was to separate from Great Britain, many founders believed this an appropriate course of action. In fact, when drafting the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson personally penned the clause declaring, "King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing. In other words, he has vetoed every legislation or every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce." In other words, this crappy commerce. I'm going to put it nicely. When America finally separated from Great Britain in 1776, while a number of states began abolishing slavery, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, etc., not every state did. And while the overwhelming majority of the founding fathers were anti-slavery, not all were. In fact, Jefferson's forceful denunciation of the slave trade in the draft of the Declaration was complained about so strenuously by delegates from Georgia and South Carolina that his original clause was removed and a milder condemnation inserted instead. So although many founding fathers had strenuously opposed slavery, a century after them, it still survived. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran for president and was elected on a platform that included ending slavery. He promptly passed a number of anti-slavery laws, but considered the progress too slow. So in the election of 1864, he called for a constitutional amendment to completely eradicate the evil. He was reelected, and Congress immediately introduced the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. The Senate quickly approved the amendment, and shortly thereafter, in late January 1865, the House chambers were packed with expectant observers awaiting the outcome of the House vote. When it was announced that the amendment had passed, a roar erupted from the thousands watching. Hats were thrown and voices were raised in exuberant cheers. Congress had voted to end slavery. How should something that profound be celebrated? The House asked Reverend Henry Highland Garnet, 1851 to 1882, to preach a sermon. Today it might sound strange to hear that a sermon was preached in the Capitol, but it was commonplace in Congress for almost a century. On December 4th, 1800, shortly after Congress first moved into the Capitol building, it authorized that on Sundays the Capitol building would be used for church services. By 1867, the largest church in Washington, D.C. was the one at the U.S. Capitol. 2,000 people a week met there for church. Garnet was very familiar with slavery, having personally experienced it. His family eventually fled slavery in the South and escaped to the North, where he became a minister, abolitionist, temperance leader, and political activist. When the Civil War erupted, he recruited black regiments for the Union and served as a chaplain to the black troops of New York. Late in the war, in 1864, he became the pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., where he was serving at the time of his famous sermon to Congress. After the war, he became president of Avery College and then was made minister to Liberia by President Ulysses S. Grant. When Reverend Garnet preached his sermon on February 12, 1865, he became the first black American to speak in Congress. He began that sermon with a recollection of his own personal experiences. What is slavery? Too well do I know what it is. I was born among the cherished institutions of slavery. My earliest recollections of parents, friends, and the home of my childhood are clouded with its wrongs. The first sight that met my eyes was a Christian mother enslaved. He then reviewed the prominent historical leaders of both church and state, including the many American founders who had opposed slavery. Augustine, Constantine, Ignatius, Polycarp, Maximus, and the most illustrious lights of the ancient church denounced the sin of slaveholding. Thomas Jefferson said, at a period of his life when his judgment was matured and his experience was ripe, there is preparing, I hope, under the auspices of heaven, a way for a total emancipation. The sainted Washington said, near the close of his mortal career, and when the light of eternity was beaming upon him, it is among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country shall be abolished by law. I know of but one way by which this can be done, and that is by legislative action. And so far as my vote can go, it shall not be wanting. The other day, when the light of liberty streamed through this marble pile or building, and the hearts of the noble band of patriotic statesmen leaped for joy, and this our national capital shook from foundation to dome with the shouts of a ransomed people, then methinks the spirits of Washington, Jefferson, the Jays, the Adamses, and Franklin, and Lafayette, and Giddings, and Lovejoy, and those of all the mighty and glorious dead, remembered by history, because they were faithful to truth, justice, and liberty, were hovering over the august assembly. Though unseen by mortal eyes, doubtless they joined the angelic choir and said, Amen. Patrick Henry said we should transmit to posterity our abhorrence of slavery. So also thought Congress. Garnett concluded by calling on the states to ratify the 13th Amendment. Let the verdict of death, which has been brought in against slavery by the 38th Congress, be affirmed and executed by the people. Let the gigantic monster perish. Yes, perish now and perish forever. Let slavery die. It has had a long and fair trial. God himself has pleaded against it. Its death warrant is signed by God and man. Do not commute its sentence. Give it no respite or reprieve, but let it be ignominiously executed, put to death with shame and horror. Honorable senators and representatives, illustrious rulers of this great nation, I cannot refrain this day from invoking upon you in God's name the blessings of millions who were ready to perish, but to whom a new and better life has been opened by your humanity, justice, and patriotism. You have said, let the Constitution of the country be so amended that slavery and involuntary servitude shall no longer exist in the United States except in punishment for a crime. Surely an act so sublime could not escape divine notice, and doubtless the deed has been recorded in the archives of heaven. Favored men and honored of God as his instruments, steadily finish the work which he has given you to do. Emancipate, enfranchise, educate, and give the blessings of the gospel to every American citizen. Significantly, the first black American to speak in Congress delivered a powerful sermon, specifically citing Exodus 21:16. And while we're here, I want to go back to something in Exodus 18:21, because we are facing a very dire situation in America. And I want to read this to you. Furthermore, you shall select out of all people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Normally I try not to too much date the podcast, but we are facing a very dangerous time in America right now. And you need to be able to stand in that voting booth because God is watching over your shoulder. And you need to be able to vote for people that follow Exodus 18:21. It doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it means that they honor God. This is not a hard command. Furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And if you have an election or a race where you cannot look at the 2 candidates or 3 candidates or whatever and say there is somebody here that I know is an honorable man who fears God, a man of truth, and who hates bribes, basically, dishonest gain. If you don't have somebody in that particular race, whether it be presidential, whether it be House, whether it be Senate, whether it be whatever it may be, then write somebody in that you know meets that qualification. Do you know how many times I've either written in somebody else or written in myself or had other people write me in or whatever it may be? Or written in men that I know that are men of integrity, whether they're on the ballot or not. Guess what? I have the right to vote third party. Or fourth party or fifth party or whatever it may be. And I'm saying all that to say this. Because if we will do Exodus 18:21 and we will vote righteously, God will protect us in the coming days. And by being protected, we will be able to do the work that our hands finds to do. And with your support of Tishua Tea Company, I want to reread this because it applies to you. Emancipate, enfranchise, educate, and give the blessings of God to every citizen of the world. Illustrious supporters of Tishua Tea Company and Liberty Unveiled and Tishua House, I cannot refrain this day from invoking upon you, in God's name and in the name of Jesus, the blessing of millions, the blessing of 63, the blessing of 41 that are currently still under our care. I cannot refrain from invoking the blessings of them who were ready to perish, but to whom a new and better life has been opened by your humanity, your justice, and patriotism. You have said, let them go free, so that slavery and involuntary servitude shall no longer exist in the world. And I know that God is paying attention. And I know that God is seeing your support. And I know that God is seeing when you share about Tishua and when you talk about Liberty Unveiled. And I know that He is equipping us and preparing us and readying us for the work ahead. Because He doesn't want anybody enslaved. Especially in sexual slavery. All forms of slavery are wicked, diabolical, evil. But there's something a little extra heinous about sexual slavery that steals the soul. It all steals the soul. I'm not even going to try to equate it because they're all the same. But it's a modern day form of slavery. And you can help us do something about it. So, go to tishuatea.com, TESHUAHTEA.com, or deliverancetea.com. Go under the donate tab. And I want to just interject something here on the donate side. None of the money that you donate goes through any of our Tishua business accounts or Tishua Tea Company business accounts. I don't touch it. Andrew doesn't even really touch it. It goes direct to the rescue facility to help us care for the girls. It costs over $21,000, $22,000 a month to care for all the girls and pay for all the staff and everything else. Now we actually have 4 staff, so instead of 2, so it's that he has even gone up. So it's probably closer to $25,000 or $26,000 a month. So it's not cheap to care for the girls, but your support helps us do that. But when you go onto the donate tab, make sure the first one there will be the PayPal link. When you go on there, don't donate. Make sure that you're watching, because PayPal has two types of ways of sending money. You have as if you're sending money to a business, and you have money or ways of sending money as if you're sending it to friends and family. Make sure that you do the type that is for friends and family, because under that type of sending money, PayPal does not charge us a fee. So in other words, if you send $100, all $100 goes towards Tishua House, instead of I think it's 10% up to $10 or something like that. So I think, if I remember right, I don't remember what the percentage is for sure, but if you donate through, like you're sending to a business, then then PayPal takes a percentage. So if you go through the friends and family side, all of that money goes to Tishua House. There's also a section on there where you can go to our Tishua Tea Company app, and you buy the app. There's some videos there that talk about how to use the app, but the app is a money-saving app. It's a rebate app. It's a charitable giving app, and we have set it up so that when you go to Amazon or Walmart or Best Buy or I think Cracker Barrel's on there, Outback's on there, Red Lobster. There's like 300 stores. When you go to the stores, you pull up the app and you buy an electronic gift card through the app, and then you hand that electronic gift card in the app to the checker, and then they scan that barcode, or they enter the number or whatever they need to do, and then a percentage of that gift card purchase goes back onto the app for you, and you're able to either donate that money, or you can save it up and purchase more gift cards later on, or whatever. But when you buy the app costs $25. $10 of that $25 goes automatically back onto the app for you to use once you hit $25 or more. $10 of it goes automatically to Tishua House, and $5 of it is the cost of the app, basically. So go on and purchase the app. It's Christmas time. We're heading close to Christmas time. So Black Friday's coming up. This is a way for you to save money, but it's also a way for you to save up or get cash back and be able to donate some of that. You can donate anywhere from 10% up to 100% of that cash back that you get to Tishua House. So as you're making these normal purchases, you're able to send some of that back to Tishua House. So a great way of being able to donate on an ongoing basis. The other thing that we're working on right now is, and I think I talked about this in last week's episode, we're in the process of trying to secure an actual location for a tea facility or for a tea shop. It would be our first tea shop here in the States. So if you feel led to donate to that, you can reach out to me at Brad at Tishua Tea Company, or excuse me, Brad at TishuaTea.com. And reach out to me and let me know. I'm going to be funding the shop by myself if we don't get donations or whatever, but it is expensive. It's an espresso machine is $6,000 plus. to produce K-Cups. That equipment's anywhere from $4,000 to $5,000 for just a very basic, small setup. The grinders are to have a packaging grinder so we can more readily offer ground coffee. That's anywhere from $500 to $1,000. A dosing grinder for measuring out when you're making espressos and stuff like that. That's $1,000 or $500 to $1,000 or more dollars. Usually $1,500, almost $2,000 for those. Plus tables and chairs and the tea service as far as cups and bowls and plates and whatnot. That stuff all costs a fair amount of money, especially unless we can buy used, which is I'm planning on doing. I can do all the renovations myself because I was a carpenter and stuff. But these are all things that we, if we can get a tea shop open, and this would allow us to have a physical location and allow us to be able to allow people to come in and try the product and get familiar with Tishua Tea Company, and it would help us get the word out. So if you would like to support that and contribute to that, please, like I said, reach out to me at brad@tishuatea.com. And I appreciate it very much, guys. I thank you so much. May the blessings of heaven be upon you as you support our work. And I really do appreciate it. It really means a lot to me. Like I said, be keeping Andrew and his family in prayer, and also be keeping Pastor Sam and his family in prayer as well as they deal with the newborn that is a meth baby, and Andrew's parent, Andrew and his family as they deal with the loss of his mom. So anyway, I love you guys. Be blessed and have a great week. Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Liberty Unveiled podcast, setting captives free one episode at a time. The Liberty Unveiled podcast is a part of the Unresolved Podcast Network and has been brought to you by Tishua Tea Company, TESHUAHTEA.com or DeliveranceTea.com.